Have you ever loved someone so deeply that you forgot to love yourself? Have you ever been made to believe that your kindness was weakness and your silence was obedience? That's what it's like growing up under the shadow of a narcissistic parent. You give, they take. You care, they control. You speak, they silence. But what happens when the empath, the one who always forgives, always understands, finally has enough? Narcissistic parents create an illusion so intricate that it often feels like love. But it's not love, it's control disguised as care, manipulation dressed as guidance. From the outside, it may look like a close family, even admirable. Yet behind closed doors, the empath child grows up walking on emotional eggshells, constantly adapting to keep the peace. The parent doesn't nurture the child's individuality. They sculpt a version of them that serves their own image. Approval is earned through compliance, affection becomes a currency, and disapproval is a silent punishment that cuts deeper than words ever could. The child learns early that love is conditional, something to be performed for, begged for, or bought through obedience. The narcissistic parent sees their child as an extension of themselves, not as a separate being with needs, feelings, and a voice. Every achievement becomes the parent's reflection, every mistake a personal insult. The child's emotions are not met with empathy, but filtered through the parent's ego. How does this make me look? When the empath cries, they're told they're too sensitive. When they succeed, the parent finds a way to take credit. And when they speak up, they're accused of being ungrateful or disrespectful. It's not parenting, it's possession. For the empath, this confusion becomes their foundation. They grow up believing that love means sacrifice, that their worth depends on how much they can endure. They apologize. For things they didn't do, accept blame for emotions that aren't theirs, and mistake control for protection. They adapt by becoming hyper-aware of moods, tones, and silences, learning to read the narcissist like a weather forecast, because one wrong word could unleash a storm. But the cruelest part of this illusion is that it makes the empath doubt their reality. The narcissistic parent rewrites history, denies wrongdoing, and shifts blame so seamlessly that the child begins to question their own memory. The empath becomes trapped in a cycle of self-blame. Maybe it really is my fault. Maybe I am too emotional. Maybe I'm the problem. This internalized guilt keeps them tethered to the illusion, afraid to see the truth because the truth would mean everything they believed about love was a lie. And yet, deep within, the empath feels a quiet knowing, a faint voice whispering that something isn't right, that love shouldn't hurt, that care shouldn't come with fear. But that voice is buried under years of gaslighting, guilt, and manipulation. It takes time, sometimes decades, for that voice to grow strong enough to challenge the illusion. When the empath finally sees it for what it is, it's both devastating and liberating. Devastating because they realize the person who was supposed to protect them was the one who wounded them most. Liberating because they finally understand it was never about being lovable enough. The narcissistic parent's love was never missing because the child was flawed. It was missing because the parent was incapable of unconditional love. The illusion shatters, and what remains is truth, raw, painful, and powerful. The empath begins to see that their sensitivity was never a weakness, but the very strength that kept them human in a house built on emotional deception. The empath's heart is a wide-open field, tender, forgiving, and endlessly willing to understand. When raised by a narcissistic parent, that compassion becomes both their greatest gift and their greatest vulnerability. From childhood, they are praised for being the good one, the helper, the peacekeeper. They learn that being selfless brings temporary calm, and in a home ruled by tension, calm feels like safety. So they give more. They listen, they comfort, they absorb every emotional storm their parent releases, until they become the family's emotional sponge, soaking up the pain that was never theirs to carry. Every outburst, every mood swing, every guilt trip, the empath takes it in and somehow makes it their fault. They tell themselves, if I can just be a little kinder, maybe they'll stop yelling. Or, if I can understand them better, maybe they'll finally see me. The empath mistakes endurance for love and compassion for control. Their empathy is pure, but under the narcissist's influence, it's weaponized against them. The parent learns quickly that guilt works better than discipline. They say things like, after all I've done for you, or you're breaking my heart. And the empath, desperate not to hurt anyone, folds under the weight of that emotional burden. Over time, this pattern becomes second nature. The empath learns to read subtle shifts in tone, to sense disappointment before it's spoken. They preemptively adjust their behavior to prevent conflict. Their entire identity becomes centered around keeping the narcissistic parent content. But there's a heavy price for that peace. Their own emotional needs are silenced. When the empath feels hurt, they swallow it. When they feel angry, they shame themselves for being ungrateful. They believe that love means endless forgiveness no matter how much it costs them. The tragedy is that the narcissist, parent often praises this selflessness, calling it maturity, calling it loyalty, while secretly depending on it. The more the empath forgives, the less the narcissist has to face themselves. The more the empath gives, the more entitled the narcissist becomes to take. It's a cycle that feeds itself. The empath's kindness fuels the narcissist's ego, and the narcissist's approval becomes the empath's oxygen. But this is not connection. It's captivity wrapped in compliments. There's always a quiet ache in the empath's heart, a deep longing to be seen, not for what they give, but for who they are. Yet every attempt to express that need is dismissed or twisted. They're told they're too emotional, too dramatic, or too needy. And because the empath believes love requires patience, they stay, forgiving the unforgivable again and again. But with each act of forgiveness, they lose another piece of themselves. Eventually, the empath begins to feel something they can't quite name, not anger, not hatred, but exhaustion. The soul grows tired of carrying someone else's pain. Forgiveness becomes fatigue, and slowly that exhaustion becomes clarity. The empath starts to see that love without respect isn't love, it's bondage. That understanding someone else shouldn't mean abandoning yourself. It's in that realization that the empath's forgiveness finally turns inward, not toward the narcissist, but toward themselves. There comes a moment in every empath's life when the weight of pretending becomes unbearable. After years of walking on eggshells, of silencing their own needs, of loving a parent who confuses control with care, something inside them begins to shift. It doesn't happen in an explosion or a dramatic confrontation. It happens quietly. One morning, the empath wakes up and realizes they feel nothing. No fear, no guilt, no desperate need to fix what's broken, just emptiness. And that emptiness is not a loss. It's the beginning of freedom. The breaking point is not rage, it's awakening. It's the sacred instant when the empath's inner voice finally rises above the noise of manipulation and fear. For years, they've been told who they are. You're too sensitive. You're ungrateful. You're impossible to please. But at this moment, something deeper whispers, "No, I'm not broken. I'm just tired of carrying what was never mine." That whisper becomes a roar of truth that cannot be silenced anymore. For so long, the empath believed love was about endurance. They thought that if they kept giving, forgiving, and understanding, eventually their parent would change, that kindness could heal cruelty, that compassion could soften control. But at the breaking point, that illusion finally dissolves. The empath sees clearly that their love did not fail, it was simply misplaced. You cannot heal someone who refuses to see themselves. You cannot reach someone who only listens to echoes of their own voice. The moment of awakening is terrifying because it feels like betrayal. The empath has been conditioned to believe that putting themselves first is selfish, that saying no is cruel, that distance is disloyalty. So even as they begin to pull away, guilt claws at their heart. But that guilt is the last chain of control, a remnant of the narcissist's training. And when the empath finds a lie recognizes that guilt as manipulation, they take their first real breath of freedom. The narcissistic parent often senses this shift before the empath even speaks it. The energy changes, the compliance fades. The child who used to over-explain now stays silent. The one who used to cry now stares back with calm clarity, and that silence, that peaceful detachment, terrifies the narcissist, because control cannot survive where clarity lives. At the breaking point, the empath begins to redefine love. Love is no longer self-sacrifice, it's self-respect. Compassion is no longer about understanding others, it's about understanding one's own limits. The empath learns that protecting their peace isn't cruelty, it's maturity. They stop waiting for closure from the one who caused the wound and start building it within themselves. And so the breaking point becomes the turning point. It's not the end of the empath's story. It's the moment they finally begin to live it. They stop chasing love and start embodying it. They stop surviving and start becoming. And for the first time, their heart beats not out of fear, but out of freedom. When the empath finally pulls away, the narcissistic parent feels the ground shift beneath them. Their world begins to tremble, not because they've lost someone they truly love, but because they've lost control. The empath was never just a child to them. They were the mirror, the reflection that made the narcissist feel powerful, important, admired. Without that reflection, the narcissist faces the one thing they've spent their whole life avoiding, their own emptiness. And that emptiness terrifies them. The narcissistic parent reacts to losing control the same way they always have, through manipulation, guilt, and fear. They might suddenly become the victim, telling everyone how ungrateful or distant their child has become. They might rewrite history, painting themselves as the loving parent who did everything, while the empath is portrayed as cruel or unappreciative. Or worse, they may switch tactics and beg for attention through false vulnerability, saying things like, "You've changed," or "You don't love me anymore." But the truth is, the empath hasn't changed. They've just awakened. The only thing that's different now is that the narcissist's usual tactics no longer work. This moment of panic exposes how fragile the narcissist's power really was. It was never built on love, but on dependency, a dynamic where the empath gave endlessly and the narcissist took without remorse. When the empath starts saying no, the narcissist loses their source of validation, admiration, and emotional supply. To the narcissist, this loss feels like death because their identity depends on others feeding their illusion of superiority. And when that illusion starts to crumble, desperation takes over. The narcissistic parent will often try to pull the empath back in through cycles of affection and cruelty. One moment, they'll use guilt. "After all I've sacrificed for you." The next, they'll use fear. "You'll regret turning your back on your own family." When that fails, they'll resort to charm, promising change, or pretending to understand. But the empath, now seeing through the manipulation, doesn't respond the same way. What once broke them now barely stirs emotion. The silence they once used to avoid conflict now becomes their shield. This shift enrages the narcissist because they thrive on emotional reactions. Indifference is their worst nightmare. The empath's calm, grounded energy acts like a mirror showing the narcissist exactly what they are: small, insecure, powerless without control. And for the first time, the narcissist realizes their words no longer have power. The performance has ended and the audience has left the stage. But the empath's withdrawal isn't about revenge, it's about recovery. They're no longer trying to prove their worth or earn affection. They've learned that they don't owe healing to the person who caused the wound. The narcissist's panic is simply a side effect of the empath's awakening, proof that power has shifted. The empath no longer dances to the tune of guilt or obligation. They stand in quiet strength, unbothered, untouchable. And that silence, that peaceful detachment, is what finally breaks the narcissist's illusion completely. The empath's greatest lesson comes in the form of a boundary. For so long, boundaries felt like betrayal, something that only selfish or ungrateful people created. That belief was planted by the narcissistic parent who convinced the empath that saying no was wrong, that putting themselves first was cruel, and that unconditional love meant unlimited access. But the truth is, boundaries are not walls, they are doors. They don't shut people out. They decide who gets to walk in, how long they can stay, and what energy they bring with them. Boundaries are the language of self-respect, and for the empath, learning to speak that language is nothing short of revolutionary. At first, setting boundaries feels terrifying. The empath, conditioned to avoid conflict, feels a deep sense of guilt even for the smallest act of self-protection. Saying, "I can't talk right now," or "that behavior isn't okay," feels like rebellion. The narcissistic parent often reacts exactly as expected, with anger, silence, or victimhood. They may say things like, "You've changed," or "I can't believe you're treating me this way after everything I've done for you." These are emotional traps designed to pull the empath back into compliance. But this time, something is different. The empath doesn't collapse. They pause, breathe, and remember that guilt is not the same as wrongdoing. The more the empath practices boundaries, the stronger they become. What once triggered anxiety now brings peace. The endless need to explain themselves begins to fade. They realize they don't owe anyone justification for protecting their energy. Silence, once a sign of submission, becomes a form of strength. The narcissistic parent's manipulation starts to lose its power because boundaries cut off the emotional fuel that feeds their control. The empath learns that saying no isn't cruel, it's kind. It's a way of saying, I love you, but I love myself too. Boundaries are not built from bitterness, they're built from clarity. They're not about punishment, but preservation. The empath starts to see that it's not their job to make the narcissist understand, heal, or approve. It's their job to stay grounded in their truth, even if it disappoints someone who thrives on chaos. For the first time, the empath's worth is not measured by how much they can give or endure. It's measured by how deeply they honor their own peace. And something beautiful happens when those boundaries take root. The empath begins to breathe differently. Their nervous system starts to calm. They no longer wake up anticipating conflict or overanalyzing every interaction. The constant tension that once lived in their body begins to ease. Boundaries, it turns out, are not the end of love. They are the beginning of healthy love. The narcissistic parent may never understand, and that's okay. The empath finally realizes that understanding isn't necessary for peace. What matters is that they've reclaimed their space, their energy, their voice. Boundaries are not barriers, they're bioma. They're bridges to freedom, and once the empath learns to protect their light, no one can dim it again. Freedom after narcissistic abuse doesn't arrive as a loud declaration. It arrives as a quiet moment of peace. For the empath, that peace feels foreign at first, almost uncomfortable. They've spent years existing in survival mode, conditioned to anticipate someone else's moods, reactions, and disappointments. When the noise finally stops, when the narcissistic parent's voice fades into the background, the silence feels strange. But slowly, that silence becomes sacred. It's the space where healing begins, where the empath starts to rebuild from the inside out. Rebirth doesn't happen overnight. It starts with small, gentle acts of self-respect. The empath begins to listen to their own needs, perhaps for the first time. They realize they don't need permission to rest, to feel, to exist. They begin to reconnect with the parts of themselves they had to bury to survive. The playful child who once dreamed freely, the creative spirit that was silenced, the inner voice that always knew the truth. Every act of self-care becomes an act of rebellion against the conditioning that taught them their worth was tied to their usefulness. The empath learns that healing isn't about forgetting what happened. It's about remembering who they were before the pain. They start to mother their own inner child, comforting the part of them that was never protected. They learn to father their inner strength, setting firm boundaries with love and authority. The same empathy that was once used against them now becomes their greatest power. They no longer absorb other people's pain. They observe it. They no longer confuse chaos with connection. They see clearly that peace isn't boring. It's the reward of survival. As the empath grows stronger, their relationships begin to change. They attract people who value mutual respect, emotional honesty, and depth. They stop trying to rescue those who refuse to heal and instead walk alongside those who choose growth. They no longer chase validation. They radiate self-assurance. The world feels different because they've finally come home to themselves. And perhaps the most profound part of this transformation is forgiveness. Not for the narcissistic parent, but for themselves. For all the years they stayed, for all the times they doubted their worth, for every moment they mistook manipulation for love. This self-forgiveness is what truly sets them free. They no longer need to prove, please, or perform. They exist simply because they are worthy. No conditions, no apologies. The empath's rebirth is not about becoming harder, it's about becoming whole. They don't lose their sensitivity, they refine it. They learn to direct their empathy inward first so that giving no longer drains them but fulfills them. And as they rise, they carry a new kind of strength. Quiet, grounded, unshakable. This is the moment the narcissistic parent's influence finally ends. Not because of confrontation or revenge, but because the empath has outgrown the need to be understood by them. They've become the love they were always searching for. And in that rebirth, the cycle breaks. For good.